Thanks a lot for your invitation to discuss this topic. In fact, a couple of years ago, when I was part of a commission presided by Meunier, and which role was to review the methods and practice of CBA for public projects in France, discussed this topic among others, but it was one of those which raised the more questions, in fact, especially one, how does it come that you could end up with, for some values of time, lower values of time than those used for 10 years before? So we were in front of this kind of question, really. And the other issue was that since we extended the CBA horizon to 2070, then we felt concerned with mid-term and long-term evolution of value of time. In the end, we just ended up reconnecting the same evolution rule as was used before, but we discussed this topic also. So as you may see on the presentation, I did also change the title while writing the paper. And I think, in fact, I tried to enlarge the topic towards more broader approach than just value of time and just maybe other issues that concern CBA. So we'll talk about, first of all, that's the topic, the value of time in French CBA guidelines and how it evolved. But also I will talk about other benefits that we usually link with value of time, review the past evolution, quantitative evolution this time, of value of time over the last 50 years, and then propose some more forward-looking considerations as regard potential impacts of changing mobility practices and CBA and project evaluation more broadly. So, first of all, we all agree on this. Value of time is really central in transport CBA. In fact, it is really at the core of CBA. CBA in transport, and CBA in transport is, at least in France, at the core of CBA in other sectors. So this is really a very important foundation. Another thing is that, as we all agree, I think also, there might be reasons to think that ICT developments, ICT, I mean information and communication technologies, of course, so that they will impact value of time perceived by the travelers. But maybe to help imagine what could be going on in the next year or decades, it's interesting to go back to what value of time is and how it has evolved in CBA, and how issues linked with value of time could also evolve in case ICT developments were to change major things, we don't know what yet, in our everyday lives, and especially as regards our mobility practices. So my proposal here is just to review how value of time grew up in France, so as to get some maybe useful clues for the future. So, the first guidelines in France date back to the very early 60s, and I put here the distorted quotation. In the beginning was the number, because really, by that time, in France we were in the 5-year plans, so the economy was growing, population also, and people thought that we could organize the economy, etc. So we needed really badly numbers to justify where the public model had to be spent. And this is really the basic element for, in fact, the appearance of value of time in France. So it was not a theoretical approach. No, it was very simple. It was observation of route choice for cars, and then the trade-off between time versus costs. And it allowed to just have a simple derivation of value of time for cars, and all this, the background for this was, of course, Jules Dupuis' approach for the surplus. So this was the basic way a number emerged in France. And then people just were not satisfied with just a number. They wanted to know what it was about. So there was some discussion in the studies by then about, well, should we take a collective value that would be different from the individual value we infer from people's behavior? So the answer was, well, in fact, we don't have really any reason to do so, for the moment at least. But they said, nevertheless, people sometimes are driving for their pleasure, for tourism or whatever. Then we should not count their value of time. It should be counted as zero. So the debate about collective value versus individual value was open then, and then it was closed ever since. Another issue is that the way people dealt with value of time by then ensured a high level of consistency, because it was the same value of time that was used for CBA and that was used in the traffic models. They were very, I would say, simple, because you had no software, no computer, etc. So you had just simple formulas. You had to get some data to feed them, of course. But anyway, you had a kind of traffic model that was completely consistent and used the same value of time as in CBA. Then, in fact, why should we have some reference values of time? Well, again, in the view of public choice, and especially in the view of the 5-year plans, etc., we had to be able to make a sound comparison between different projects. And the criteria was to be the socioeconomic performance of a project. So there were many projects competing for public funding, and it was necessary to have some kind of objective rule to choose between the projects. It meant that people had to take care about equity, neutrality, etc. And one way of dealing with equity was to take one value of time. So whether it was a very wealthy man driving his car, or just someone that could just afford buying a car but was in debt for 30 years afterwards, it was the same value of time. This is a way of implementing equity by then. Anyway, what was important was to have some common national reference values. Well, compared to the economic approach, which tries to stick as close as possible to the values that people reveal in their behavior, well, there was a kind of it's not a ditch, it's really a very, very big distance between the two. In fact, in practice, the pure economic value is much more variable. And so how did people deal with this? Well, it meant, in fact, as we will see, that we went toward an increased differentiation of values of time in the guidelines. And, in fact, the traffic models, especially when we got computers and so on, and softwares that could manage to, it was not big data, but by the time it was considered big data to have thousands of numbers. Then the value of time for CBA, so for estimating the net present value, became different from the value used in models. So here's a table of the, I don't know if you can see it clearly because it's the screen, it's just half the screen here. But, well, anyways, it's in the paper. And I will just comment a few elements, maybe more in detail than I was thinking too. Anyways, what you can see here is the degree of differentiation and the degree of evolution from the guidelines, the first ones at the beginning of the 16th to the last one. And you can see that the columns are rather flat at the beginning, and then they are really full at the end. This shows just graphically that differentiation has really begun to appear maybe 20 years ago or so, and then more recently has really exploded. The first differentiation was introduced very rapidly. In fact, it was just introducing something that had to do with value of time, even if it was not treated as value of time. It was comfort parameters introduced for motorways. And why this? It's just because observation of route choice showed that there was something, some kind of constant that appeared and was needed to explain people's behavior. So again, no theoretical consideration. It was just observation, then conclusion, yes, we should take account of this. Then you cannot trade, but in 1986, suddenly the collective values, in fact, appear, in fact, to be counted 50% higher as the individual values for cars. All these first values were for cars. Why was that? Why was this? In fact, it was just, there was just a very, very rapid comment in the official guidelines for intermodal reasons. And my guess is that by then, in the 80s, you had many rail projects, and you had to take account that people driving, especially on long distances by rail, probably had a higher value of time, and then the decision was taken just to keep one value of time for CBA, but to make it more, in fact, consistent with what was used, what could be used for train projects. And afterwards, the individual value was kept back for the collective values, and many differentiations were implemented. First one was in 1995, new modes. In fact, the guidelines became valid for all transport modes. And what's funny, I checked this morning, in fact, is that the train value for common trains was indeed 50% higher than for car values. So it reassured me on the interpretation of what happened in 1986. In 2004, there was a big explosion of differentiation. One is especially interesting. It was that we introduced differentiations for the Parisian region, the richer region in France. So it was kind of, I will say, a trade-off between the equity considerations and the economic soundness of a CBA. So the decision was taken, and it's still been taken to differentiate between Parisian area and other regions. And also, there was a differentiation, as is now usual in most countries, for different purposes, different modes, and also as concerns distance. And in the latest guidelines, the differentiation by distance was confirmed and refined, and also was introduced values for comfort and for reliability. So this is just to show you how it evolved, really. And the differentiation reason was not, in fact, for instance, between modes. It was not, I would say, a public choice to say that, well, this mode should be preferred to this one, so we will decide to get a higher value of time for this mode. No, it was really due to auto-selection as concerns trip purpose, income level, etc. The differentiation of value of time by distance, well, it's something that has proven to be rather robust by revolved preferences, but it's not so sure that it's really the distance that is the main parameter. Does it rather reveal non-linear preferences in time? It's not so clear, so this is still a question. Besides this, the road comfort parameter was from the beginning by distance, but maybe it's more understandable because road comfort relates more naturally to a kind of physical comfort. You have many bumps per kilometer or whatever, so you can feel, in fact, the comfort in physical terms. So maybe the distance is a good way of measuring things. So now I'll come to the other benefits, or some of them, that are usually linked with value of time. First of all, comfort. I've given here the rules that were used now for valuing comfort in public transport, in public urban transport. You can see, well, we differentiate between the situation of the people. Well, if there are still some seats available, then no reason to change the value of time. But if it becomes to be a little crowded, well, it's more uncomfortable for people, whether you are seated or standing. Of course, because if you are standing, it's natural. You are less comfortable. If you are seated, also because you have to enter the wagon, find a seat, and then exit with many people to go by. So this is the way it was naturally done. We used the value of time and just corrective coefficients. For reliability, well, more recently there was an update of rules in the guidelines. Anyway, we use standard way to do things. Anyway, in the end, variation is surplus is supposed to be proportional to value of time with a reliability ratio and using also an indicator of travel time spreading. But in reality, how were these coefficients derived? In fact, from observation of actual behavior, but then an estimation of a ratio between the variation of surplus that was measured and value of time multiplied by travel time. So in fact, the notion of value of time is so central in CBA that really it detracts everything else. And we try to link the other benefits to value of time. Now I come to the quantitative evolution over the last 50 years. Well, what you can perhaps see here, it's difficult again, but this is the value of time in the French guidelines for the year the guideline was issued. but in constant money value. You see, well, it has some increasing trend, but not so strong, whereas in the meantime, the GDP per capita was multiplied almost by 3. So it seems that the importance of value of time could have decreased in CBA. In fact, it's not at all the case, because travel time gains still in most transport projects have really the main importance in the advantages of the projects. Usually it's about 80% or so, or maybe more sometimes, of the advantages of the project. What changed, though, is that the environmental consequences, which weighted, well, nothing up to 20 years ago, then began to represent 1% or so. And now they are more, they have gained another order of magnitude, and there they might be on some projects 10%, perhaps 20%. So, now I come to the evolution rules that were used for updating value of time, because when you consider a transport project, it is built for 50 years or 100 years or even more. So in the very first report in 1960, a rule was proposed to update, in fact, the value of time relatively to the household's consumption per capita as the evolution was forecast. Still, people considered that, yes, it should evolve for various reasons, but there's another thing, which is that more and more people will get access to cars, and then they will tend to have lower income, and so it will partially counterbalance this effect. So this was identified at the very beginning. But then in the first guidelines, this was the study that preceded the first guideline. But in the first guidelines, this was abandoned. It was just a flat rule, the same, fixed value of time for all the CBA evaluation period. Perhaps because people considered that the two effects counterbalance exactly each other. So there's an impact on value of time evolution of some structural evolutions. And this has to be taken in account when we think about value of time. Perhaps also another tentative observation is that it seems that the elasticity of value of time to income seems to be not so strong as could be expected. It seems to be rather well below 1, and it's possibly diminishing. Well, if so, it would be interesting to try to look backward and see if it could be linked to other uses of the travel time that were evolving in the last decades, for instance. And perhaps it would be worthwhile doing this just to understand why we could observe such an evolution, a rather flat evolution of value of time. So I've figured out here something else, which is, well, the evolution of the value of time for the year 2010 as seen from the successive guidelines. So it includes the evolution rules that I just spoken about. So as you can see, well, it's difficult, it's very difficult to see, you cannot see, okay. But in fact, first thing is that when you take a flat rule, it underestimates the final value of time. But when you take an elasticity of 1, you overestimate it. So it confirms the fact that it seems to be rather low elasticity. But the last parts of the curves here show the extreme values for car introduced by the differentiation of value of time. And you see this is a major spread. It doesn't concern a big percentage of the demand, but still the unit values really have exploded. And this is, in fact, another comparison, which is here for three countries, United Kingdom, Germany, and France. And in a paper a couple of years ago, we have tried to compare this. And well, what you can see is that you don't have really a strong trend that appears. At least, in fact, there should be some kind of a logic behind this, but it doesn't seem to be very apparent. And in fact, when you try to get down to how the values came out, you realize that some methodological choices for measuring values of time were at stake in this, especially for Germany. Now I will get to some more prospective considerations as regards differentiation of value of time, and then some types of impacts ICT may have. So first of all, well, in fact, ICT allows us to have many diverse activities during our travel time. Well, if we go again in the same logics of ever and ever differentiating the value of time, well, we would end up with something which you have seen the explosion, the recent explosion. Where should we go then? It would be very complex to, first of all, to derive significant figures for all these cases, these numerous cases, and how could you use them? In fact, ICTs may have many other consequences. The first remark I wanted to make is that, well, they will not only impact what's going on during the transport, but also what you do at work or at home. So, in fact, and other places where you're not moving. So, well, if they impact them in the same way, the difference will be perhaps negligible. Another impact possible would be on comfort and reliability. Well, in fact, the problem is that, for instance, physical discomfort is not obviously linked to ICT-induced changes, and perhaps their impact is not necessarily linked with travel time. I have given a few examples in the paper to try to convince you of this, and especially, in fact, for reliability. Especially, in fact, because, well, reliability with transport, if you improve your reliability, well, whatever use of the time you have during the travel, it will impact, in fact, what will happen after you arrived, in fact, essentially. So it's not really necessarily linked to the value you give to the time in transport. Well, for CBA, again, there are maybe other impacts of ICTs. Well, first of all, CBA needs, in fact, to measure the evolutions of value of time. But also, CBA needs to anticipate what this evolution will be, because we deal with long-term horizons. So, well, we had already a kind of discussion on revealed preferences, stated preferences, and etc. But whatever the solution, well, we need models, or we need also, for standard preferences, to, in fact, imagine some situations and ever-increasing number of situations to place people in situations of choice, to reveal their preferences for many diverse activities of ICT. So it would be a complex way of dealing with things, but it could be possible, but rather complex. But anyways, even if you use stated preferences, you would need to feed back the traffic models with the new information you get. And the traffic models should be able to use properly this new information. So we can maybe try to get back to the basic surplus variation measure. You have to multiply the value of time by the variation of travel time. In fact, the problem is that ICT may influence both terms. And probably, in fact, they might also influence a lot travel times. So traffic models would need to evolve to, in fact, consider in consistent way these evolutions. First of all, also, if we assume that value of time will decrease, well, it would mean, in practice, that the importance of costs would rise, which means, all things equal, besides this, that we would get logically more traffic on low-speed transport. Another issue is that, in fact, the traffic models, if ICT have an influence on mobility practices, then the traffic models should capture this influence on the choice of transport modes or the choice of route. For instance, perhaps we would have also to get the information, does this transport means at that time on this link provide such ICT possibility or not. So it would become more and more complex again. If we go again in the direction of diversification, traffic models and value of time have encountered until now. And also maybe a special type of ICT is all the, in fact, automatic routing devices that we have all on our smartphones, and that might have also macro consequences. The traffic models do not capture this right now. Maybe they should. So, in fact, well, the models should evolve. First of all, anyways, they have to evolve, even without speaking of ICT, because one consequences, besides a possible impact on value of time, is that transport supply is evolving rapidly. You have many new kinds of services that are made possible by ICT that were not possible before. So, whatever the situation, traffic models will have to evolve. Now, as regards the user time while traveling, well, you have some. I have reviewed a few kinds of models. The first one, the time cost models. Well, if you have a distribution of value of time that crashes down to zero, it would be difficult perhaps to use them. You may imagine using more usual models, the four-step models, well, to refine them, integrating more diversified ways of making activities. But in fact, the impacts of ICT are not limited to the choice of activities while you're traveling, which indeed may give added value to your trip, of course. But it's deeper than this, because in fact, well, I've exposed here an example. Right now with ICTs, you may, rather than getting to a store to choose something to buy, you may choose it while at home or while traveling, and then you can choose to get it delivered at your home, or to get it en route, for instance, in a train station while you're traveling. And it might impact also your travel choices then. So this leads us to another kind of model, the activity-based models, which have developed quite a while during the last 20 years. Well, their basic logics are quite complex, but maybe their approach could be more adaptable to the representation of ICT changes. For the moment, they just try to figure out what if value of time decreases a lot. For instance, what if autonomous vehicles change drastically the speed flow curves? They have tried, in fact, to figure out what change in usual parameters induced by ICT would change with the same logics. But they could, in fact, go a little forward using their logic and trying to represent also the choice of the activities as, in fact, influence also that the evolution of ICTs. So I will now come to my conclusion. Well, anyways, we have seen that the value of time issue remains central for CBA, even though its importance has diminished a little. Well, it would be worthwhile trying to review value time past evolution, maybe with comparisons between many countries, to see if there was also already in the last decade some kind of influence of new activities on board trains, etc., and perhaps also the beginnings of ICT applications. Maybe we had the reflex to, in fact, to stick to value of time for valuing other kinds of benefits. Maybe we could consider doing in another way. And maybe also the ever-increasing differentiation. Well, we can deal with it with our computers, softwares, etc. We can deal with big data, etc. There's no problem about this. But is it sound to do this and to go in this ever-increasing direction? And also, in fact, it's difficult to isolate the value of time issue when we considered ICT impacts. And maybe we should consider also the evolution of traffic models and also models for deriving measures for values of time, possibly between using some kind of post-activity-based models. But to conclude with this review and rather prospective review, I think we should in fact try to go back also to the question of a collective value public choice decides to put on travel time savings. Maybe with if there are some really sharp evolutions in the future, it would be an important question to discuss. Thanks for your attention.